Hey everyone, SynthMaster here, and welcome to part 2 of SynthMaster 2.9. Now in the previous video we spent a little bit of time going over the structure of SynthMaster, doing some subtractive synthesis, nothing too fancy, and I wanted to save some of the other synthesis modes for this video. So in this video we will talk a little bit about the FM capabilities, although I won't be going too deep into FM because it's a very complicated topic, and there are people who actually done better videos about FM than I will ever make. So for FM I'm going to point you towards sound and voltage. It's either there or there. He's currently doing a very in-depth video series about FM synthesis. It's not done yet, still a work in progress, but it's well worth checking out because it's super high detail and very easy to understand, and it can definitely better explain the FM process than I will ever be able to. So go check that out. So we are going to mess around with some FM, the other wavetable modes. We will encounter some bugs and some weirdness in SynthMaster which are worth discussing. And I also want to show some of the presets. So without further ado, let's get in there. Now we're also not going to do too complex of a patch this time. And that's just due to the nature of SynthMaster. It's a very deep synthesizer. It's just not the most intuitive and easy to work with. And I don't want to make these videos any more confusing than is necessary. That being said, let's start with FM synthesis, right? Nice and easy start to get you warmed up to the concept. What we have going on here is a init patch. We'll set it to a sine wave. Now the way you do FM in SynthMaster is fairly straightforward. You have a FM source here in your oscillator, and here you can choose one or multiple of the modulators. Now this also means you're not going to make very complex DX7 types of algorithms because you're simply limited to these inputs, but we will cover feedback in a second. Let's just pick modulator 1. Modulator 1 is right here. This is also a sine wave, so now we have FM synthesis with a sine wave. Not too complicated, and you can of course tune this to offset it. One fun thing to do with FM synthesis is to automate the volume control. Right click, add modulation, and for this I'm just going to grab ADSR2. And what I want to do here is in ADSR2, make a short little bumpy thing, with a bit of an attack slope, a bit more of a decay time. And you get that kind of classic FM thumpy sound. You can also change the shape of the FM wave. To any shape you want, you have to your disposal all the waveforms that are included. You can also load random waveforms to just see what happens. What is convenient here is that you can change the envelope amount, which also controls the FM amount, so that's pretty handy. And this way you have a fair bit of control. Now one oddity we run into when playing around with FM is quite often in the algorithms you see on, for instance, the DX7, which is quite famous, are the stacked FM carriers, operator constructions. I'll flash one on the screen. You might think, well, we have 4 modulators, so we should be able to do this. And if you take the FM source of modulator 1, you do indeed get a nice little list. But if you select anything other than mod 1, it will not change the modulator. So that's a little bit annoying, but it does give us a chance to talk a little bit about the feedback part first, and then we'll talk a little bit about how to work around this modulation issue. So if we FM modulator 1 with modulator 1, we create a feedback loop. Now, this generally results in noise, unless you can modulate the feedback. And there's no real clear way to do this. So this is just feedback at 100% feeding into itself. And normally with FM feedback, you would have a attenuation dial to limit the amount of feedback. The only way to do it in SynthMaster is by attenuating the volume. And this is also your attenuator for the feedback, apparently. So if you want to do a FM feedback loop, that's the way to do it. You need to limit the volume of your carrier signal. It works. It isn't perfect, but it definitely works. Now, how do you modulate modulators with each other? Well, the only way to do this is to not use modulator 1, but for instance use modulator 2. Here you can select modulator 1. So now modulator 1 is modulating modulator 2, which is then modulating the oscillator. And that works quite well. Here, of course, you can use the modulators to control any of the parameters, so you can have some fun with this. For instance, do a very slow LFO to the fine tune. Let's make it a really slow LFO. If we speed this up a little bit. And with the delay parameter, you can create kind of a vibrato style thing where if the note is held longer, you will go into a vibrato. A little bit of attack. Which is quite fun. So there is some FM potential here, although you do need to obey the workflow of SynthMaster and you need to be fairly creative. So I wouldn't say this is going to be your favorite FM synthesis thing. It's not going to be great at emulating DX7 sounds or any of the DX series synthesizers. So yeah, still cool to have a lot of functionality here. Just keep in mind it does come with some limitations. I've also found a couple of times when messing around with modulation and FM that especially when you're doing the feedback loops, it does tend to be a bit unstable. So I actually had a few crashes of the software, which was pretty annoying if you don't have autosave. So tread carefully. Let's quickly disable all this madness. And we're back to sine wave. We also have AM, same concept as FM, only with amplitude, of course. You can select your modulators, and if you want to chain modulators, you need to select, for instance, modulator 2, and you can modulate this with modulator 2 or modulator 1, and that way you can chain AM modulators as well. Again, it runs into the same limitations as FM, but it's still nice to have some options here. Now, another thing that is a little bit odd, and for this I'm just going to grab the pulse wave. So with the pulse wave, if you change the phase, that's rather loud, you can change the shape of the waveform. But the odd thing here is if you change the algorithm, from let's say to bit crush, this knob will be renamed to bits, but it's still the phase knob. So that's a little bit of a polish thing, which is a little bit odd. Now if we move to the square wave, it does actually change the bits, but now we have the problem of not having a phase knob. Changes to low pass, you can change the phase again, and it will remember this where you go to bit crush. Nope, it won't. We're just going to phase reset and after the bit crush option. I think that's a little bit odd, and it's definitely a little bit of a lack of polish that these knobs don't properly correspond to what they do. Again, it's not the end of the world, but it's just, it doesn't quite feel as nice as it could be. One thing we also didn't bother to talk about in the previous video is some of the advanced oscillator types. So far we've mostly looked at the basic oscillators, which are just subtractives with a load of waveforms. You can also switch to additive synthesis, where you can change the waveforms here. And add partials with the volume, the pen, and the detune. And you also have waveforms per partial, which is an interesting concept. Although you don't have a phase knob here, so the pulse is completely useless. With the additive synthesizer, you can both do frequency or phase modulation, and you still have the different mod sources and the AM sources to your disposal. You also get these algo buttons down here, but it isn't very clear how to actually control this, as there is no control included in this screen. It's a little bit weird, and I'm not quite sure what the concept here is, to be honest. There's also some wavetable possibilities. You can load different wavetables with your index knobs. You can swipe them. And all the controls, aside from that, are the same as with the normal oscillator. So you have your pitch tracking and your drift and your coarse fine tuning and your unison controls down here. Now you can import your own waveforms into this wavetable synthesizer mode, but you have to put them in a very specific folder, and they need to be a pretty specific format to work. Would have loved to see just an import function here, because that's a bit annoying. And it means that if you have a lot of wavetables, you're going to have to store them in different places. Aside from that, the wavetable customizability and editing is very limited. You can delete and add frames if you want to, but it's basically a process of clicking every frame, right-clicking, removing, then clicking, right-clicking, removing, etc. to clear up some space. And if you want to insert something, you can say insert waveform, and you can insert from any of these waveforms you have. It's not great. It's not like you can take a waveform and an end waveform and morph between them. It's really rather primitive when it comes to it. So I'm not super impressed with this wavetable. You're better off just grabbing Vital for free and actually get a lot more wavetable synthesis possibilities. It's a nice to have, but yeah, it's not great. So let's not spend too much time here. Let's move on to vector, which is somewhat more interesting. In vector mode, you can set every corner to a waveform. So let's do a square on this end, sine here, and let's do something odd on this side. So let's just grab whatever. And now we can move this dot around and change our waveform. This is pretty nice. You have a 2D or a 1D mode. And of course you can modulate these parameters to taste, so you can, for instance, throw an LFO on these things and get some pretty interesting effects out of it. You also get the FM and phase modulation options here, and a AM source as well to play around with. Do note that the vector mode does not have the unison, so you can't unison layer it at this level. Of course you can unison layer the entire layer, so there's still some options there. It's good to note that the oscillator types can be different between the two oscillators, so there's a little bit of versatility there as well. The last mode we have is the audio in mode, which allows you to route audio into this synthesizer, which can be quite useful if you want to use the effects here to modulate your incoming audio, for instance. It's a good concept. I don't see it being the most useful thing in the world. So I think for the most part, the interesting things here are the basic and the additive modes combined with the subtractive engine and the effects. Now there is another issue we need to talk about for a second, and that's the via routing. Now via routing is an interesting concept. You can route any modulation source to any modulation destination through another modulation source. So that's interesting. For instance, I could say I want to take the LFO1, which is still connected to the wave index, which is quite interesting because there is no wave index anymore. So let's just clear that. Now let's say we take LFO1 and route it to the pen. Let's do that. So we say pen, LFO1. Now if I do this, obviously you will get, let's slow it down a little bit, this effect. Now if I choose route via and I say let's route this through an envelope, let's say ADSR2. You may notice that ADSR2 is currently not doing anything. It's not showing any modulation at all. And if we look at ADSR2, the little ball thingy isn't even moving. If we add a ton of attack time, for instance, nothing. So at first I thought this functionality was just straight up broken. Turns out it isn't, but it needs some trickery to get to work. So in order for the ADSRs to fire, they need themselves to be modulating something. If this ADSR is not targeted at something directly, it will not do the via thing as well, which is really odd and curious, and it's just a straight up bug. Yeah, so we can make this work by saying, let's take ADSR2, let's send it to whatever. For instance, the cutoff, then we can set it to not have any influence, 0-ish. And now, if we look at our little pen, we see the ADSR actually changing things up, which is quite weird that it works like that, but it is what it is. So that's a bit of a bug. If you've tried to use VIA and it didn't work, that's a trick you can use. It's odd that it is that way, but it is what it is, I guess. In the previous video, I also showed the arpeggiator for a second. Now the arpeggiator is quite cool. You can arpeggiate. You have a few basic arpeggiation modes like the standard up-down or the up-down inclusive. You can make it run over 2 octaves. Or even 4 octaves. You have some speed settings as well. So that's quite flexible. And you have some different velocity settings here. You can go into a sequence mode where you can sequence your notes to whatever liking. You have a per note duration. But you can't set the length of an individual step. You can overtake other steps. And you have some hold and slide options as well. Aside from painting things in, you can also play things in. So let's quickly set it to default. Let's set it back to a sequencer and let's play something in. Which is pretty good. MIDI output is also an option you can use here. And the sequencing can be copied, which makes it a bit easier to distribute it between the layers if you want to have the same sequence going on both layers, for instance. Quite a neat little sequencer with quite a few options. And if you're really invested, you can also do drum sequencing with SynthMaster. Although I personally haven't had the patience to really dive into that. I think a last thing we should do is go through a few presets, and I think it's always fun to just kind of grab whatever and see whatever happens. So let's go into the all presets. Alright, so that's SynthMaster 2.9, and I think I've covered basically everything this synth has to offer. So what are my thoughts about it? I think it's a synthesizer that's very ambitious. They try to cram a lot of stuff in here, and to their credit, a lot of the stuff works. But it also makes it a bit of a weird synth to work with. It's not the easiest, not the most intuitive, especially with some of the other synthesis modes. It just doesn't all work quite as elegantly as you might want to. At the full price tag, I would say I wouldn't recommend it. With the current discount price, if you are still looking for a good subtractive synthesizer, it may well be worth picking up. If you grab this and Vital, you have quite a big base of sounds covered, and SynthMaster does come with a lot of very usable presets as well, so that's a very good offer of them. Now, if you're completely new to synthesis, would I recommend this as your first synth? I don't know, I think I would still say just grab Vital first, go have a spin at that, and if you're still missing things, you can look into SynthMaster, for instance, to fill in the gaps. So that's it for this video. If you have any questions, leave them down below, and see you in the next one.